Check, 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 check. But no. What if we? Oh, my mic isn't. Yeah.
Needed to be taken, an argument would be found to say, let's just put it off one more year in the hope things get better. What harvest strategies are doing is they're saying, no, you set up the rules first and then you stick to the rules. Because if you don't have that situation,
Right-click your.
So if I could ask people to take their seats, and we'll get started. Second call.
Last call. Don't have to go home, but I know you do have to stay here.
Hi, Chad.
That's him. Our leader and our wrangler.
Wrangler. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to day one of a 2-day spread over 3 calendar day workshop on reference points for Gulf of Mexico Menhaden. Most of you know me. My name is Mike Jones. I've been asked by the Fishery Commission to help facilitate the conversation that we're going to have this afternoon, tomorrow, and Friday morning. I'm kind of I think reasonably legitimately described as a kind of a detached observer of this process. I'm a professor at Michigan State University. I work mostly on fisheries in the Great Lakes, pretty familiar with stock assessment and management strategy evaluation and the sort of technical aspects of what we're going to be talking here, but have never worked on Gulf of Mexico fisheries prior to leading the previous workshop for this group earlier on. We're here all afternoon today. We'll probably wrap up the main part of the meeting sometime around 4:15 this afternoon to give the modeling team a few minutes at the end of the day to do some final preparation for the technical material that's mostly going to be presented tomorrow. That won't be something where we'll be throwing everybody else out of the room, but it'll probably be of relatively little interest to you, so it'll give you a chance to get away a little early, and then we'll be back. Steve, what time are we planning to start tomorrow morning? 8:30?
8:30 is sorry, Joe. 8:30 is a reasonable time, I think.
Okay.
And we're going to have significant food and beverage down here in the morning. So
no need to get breakfast. It'll be here.
Ed, do you want to come sit at the table? You need to participate. You sure? Okay.
There's plenty of seats. Yeah. So as Steve said, there will be food here tomorrow morning, and I believe there's coffee at the back and other refreshments that will be refreshed as the afternoon progresses. We'll take a break sometime in about an hour and a half or so, and then we're back at 8:30 tomorrow morning. My understanding is that everybody that's here today is a legitimate participant in the discussions that we'll be having. So any of you, that's why we're kind of eager to have you sit at the table. If you're really insistent on not sitting at the table, that's fine too. When you do have a comment to make, please press the button in front of you, turn your microphone on so that all of the discussion that occurs is recorded. I have a lapel microphone, so I'm being recorded right now. If you remember, and I know I often forget, but if you remember when you say something, identify yourself first so that the record that the commission is keeping has a record of who is speaking, and also so that there may be, I don't know if there are, Steve, but there may be people joining us through a GoToMeeting connection, and obviously they can't see who's speaking, so it would be helpful for them to know who is speaking. We do have a period at the end of the afternoon, and we will have at the end of each day for public comment. But basically, everybody that's here this afternoon is invited to ask their questions as we proceed through the agenda. If there are people listening in on GoToMeeting, we would ask that you reserve your questions and comments until the end of the afternoon, but you'll have an opportunity to talk about those during the public comment period. Okay. I really don't have a lot to say about process other than sort of a standard admonition from facilitators for exercises like this when we're discussing an issue that may at times raise differences of opinion about how to proceed or what's going on and so on and so forth, is to be hard on the problem, not on the people. So be respectful of the opinions of all of the people in the room, but try to ask hard and penetrating questions to get to the core of what we understand and what we don't understand. So I'm going to begin. Yes, Steve.
If you want to get the Wi-Fi,
Wi-Fi.
That's the connection right there, and that's the password. If you haven't figured it out, there's a few of these around the table also. And we're passing around a sign-in sheet.
I'm just about to do that. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Good. So I'm going to ask you all to, we're going to go around the room and have you each introduce yourselves. And as we're doing that, you could all, I'm going to pass this around, and as I have done here, just fill in your name, your affiliation, and some contact information for the record. And so I'm going to have you to double duty here, fill out the form and introduce yourself at the same time. Again, microphone, please.
Hey everybody, Mary Ann Cafone, Recirculating Farms Coalition. I'm local here in New Orleans.
Amy Schuler, National Marine Fisheries Service.
Charlotte Runzel, National Audubon Society.
Chad Hansen, the Pew Charitable Trust, based in Florida.
Trevor Moncrief, Mississippi Department of Marine Resources.
Jason Adrians, Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries.
Peter Hemchak, Omega Protein.
Sean Dien, attorney working with Omega Protein.
Scott Herbert, Daybrook Fisheries.
Robert Leaf, University of Southern Mississippi.
Ben Landry, representing Omega Protein.
Dave Donaldson, Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission.
Francois Cattell, West Bank Fishing.
John Maresca, Alabama Marine Resources.
Steve Vanderkooy, Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission.
Doug Butterworth, University of Cape Town, and working with Francois Cattell on this issue.
Ed Swindell, Marine Process Services.
Great, thank you. Joe, I can just leave my microphone on, right? That's not going to cause you two other microphones? Okay, I will keep my distance from you. All right. Okay, very good. So the agenda for the workshop, this is a slightly edited version of the version that Steve circulated to all of you about a week ago, I'm thinking. So this afternoon, we're going to start with just sort of a lot of background this afternoon to try to get us all up to speed on what led to the technical work that you're mostly going to hear about tomorrow. So I'm going to talk briefly about the workshop that most of you, but not all of you, participated in February. Just a brief summary of what that workshop was about and what we where we ended up at the end of that workshop. And then I'll sort of end that with sort of what are we doing here, what are we trying to accomplish, what are our goals. And then we're gonna show a short video which you saw at the February meeting, and you now are going to see the star of the video in the flesh here. So we're going to let Doug's words speak for himself initially on a video, and then he's going to be prepared to sort of elaborate and answer any questions that you have about the process. It's very, very important that we all have a pretty good common understanding of what management strategy evaluation is for the purposes of our discussions tomorrow. So we really want to make sure that we're all on the same page there. And aspects of it are pretty technical, but it's not very complicated conceptually. And that's what Dr. Butterworth's presentation will really help us with. We'll talk about the work that Doug is going to summarize, the work that was done prior to the February workshop that sort of helped us to just deliberate on how we wanted to proceed technically with the development of reference points. So we'll have a bit of a review of that. And that'll end up with us thinking about what charge this modeling team or analytical team was left with at the end of the February workshop that we kind of collectively agreed on, And Robert, who is part of that team, is going to briefly sort of cover what that group has done since we met in February, leading up to this meeting, including some technical discussions that occurred this morning and yesterday. And that's sort of my sense of where we'll get to this afternoon. We may get through that more quickly, in which case we may begin on the more technical part of the agenda that right now is showing as beginning tomorrow. So tomorrow, most of the day will be given over to really kind of what we would call lifting the hood on the analysis and looking at the details of the way in which the data have been analyzed, the models that have been used to try to forecast consequences of different harvest strategies in the future to allow us to evaluate this reference points question. So there's a series of steps here. I'm not going to belabor what those bullet points mean right now. We'll get into them, but that's going to be kind of the meat of our discussion, is going to be sharing with you the outcomes of the analytical work that this modeling team has done. And then that'll lead to us thinking about where we are at with the going forward part of this. So having done gone through an analytical process, there may be a number of questions that will point us to future work that needs to be done by the analytical team based on your input at this point. Or we may be at a point where we're ready to really kind of discuss how we might go from the theoretical work that has been done to this point to a practical decision about how to move forward with the management of this fishery. And that, in that context, we'll discuss sort of alternative scenarios, if you will, for how we would move forward with regards to the role that the states might play in moving forward, the role that the Menhaden fishing industry might play. And then the sort of final stages of the meeting will be to sort of determine where we get to with regards to what it says here, candidates for final MP. MP is the acronym for management procedure. And it basically refers to the rules that you would use to take information that you have from the fishery and make decisions about how to manage the fishery in the future. Reference points are part of the management procedure. Another thing that's part of the management procedure is the restrictions, if any, on exploitation or harvest that would result from assessment of the state of the fishery relative to those reference points. So we'll be kind of sort of that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of all this analysis. What can we say about management strategies or management procedures going forward that might meet the collective goals and aspirations of the various stakeholders that are present here? With any management process, any procedure that is used to try to help to make more transparent and more straightforward the process of management, you have to consider the possibility that things will happen that you never expected to happen. And the words that are used in the sort of management strategy evaluation world for that is exceptional circumstances. So we would also want to have a discussion about what might constitute exceptional circumstances. If we are going to move forward with a management procedure, under what circumstances would we feel obligated to deviate from that management procedure or to reconsider the decisions that the management procedure might suggest? What you're trying to do is find that happy place between not creating a situation where every time you make a decision, there's some exceptional circumstance that influences the choices you make, but not being in a situation where you're so locked in on a process that common sense is telling you this is a dumb idea, but you're still going to go ahead with it because you have this procedure. That's what we're kind of looking for there. And that's what we have to cover over the next 2 days then. So does anybody have any questions about the agenda or what we're here for? Or is that pretty straightforward? All right, excellent. Yes, Chad.
I'm not sure this is a question. Chad Hansen. I'm not sure it's a question about the agenda per se. But I'm trying to, as I read the paper and going back through the notes and stuff, and like the primary reason to get together to start this exercise was coming out of the stock assessment. And the paper seems to, and the discussion agenda seems to be pointing to, management implications and the procedures for that. So I want to make sure that we tie this back into how does this relevant for stock status and the assessment to fulfill the recommendation that came out of that BAM model and that CIE review. So I don't see that specifically addressed here, but maybe it's going to be encapsulated in the conversation. But I want to make sure that we focus on that as a primary objective.
Okay. I want to make sure I understand. I clearly understand. So what you're referring to is that earlier last year, I guess it was, there was a review of the stock assessment model for Gulf Menhaden, and there were recommendations that came out of that. Are you referring to the recommendations with regards to the selection of reference points or other recommendations?
No, I'm just saying generally that to make sure that what we're talking about, what comes out of this process, will fulfill the recommendation that there's a legitimate bona fide way to gauge the status of the stock for an assessment purposes. So I just want to make sure that that's a focus and not necessarily when do we set catch limits or not, that sort of thing.
I see. Okay. Okay.
That just seems, that was ostensibly the primary reason to work on reference points. So we got to keep that in focus.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, I maybe you could sort of remind us of that as we go on. My sense is that where that really plays into what we will be talking about here is the reference points in the management procedure. It's based on the reference points is based on assessed abundance or some measure of the status of the stock. And so the question would be, do we have an adequate measure of the status of the stock in order to inform that? And if we don't, what are the implications of that? I think that's kind of,
that's roughly, and I'm sure we'll have those conversations.
Yeah.
But I'm just wanted to make sure that it's part of setting the stage here.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Any other questions, comments about the agenda? We have a couple more faces in the room since we went around the table. Do you want to just extend the introductions to the...
Jerry Mambretti, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department.
Thanks, Jerry. And we have two gentlemen that are, dare I say, in the peanut gallery. Camp chaperone.
We do have chairs if y'all want to please come participate. I'm afraid that you can send me a bill. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, then. All right.
Okay, so let's flip back up to the top of the agenda, if you would, Steve. So so I'm going to jump into sort of refreshing our memory on what we talked about at the February workshop. So that first PowerPoint or the PowerPoint that you have would be kind of our next item of business.
We do have copies of the February workshop printed out in the back.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to mention that. So yeah, this is going to be a very compressed summary of the, flip to the next slide, a very compressed summary of the workshop. There's the detailed notes from the workshop, or there's copies of it at the back of the room if you want to refer to that. So does it make sense for you to advance this, or does it make sense for you to just hand it off to me? I know we talked about this before, and I'm changing my mind.
You just arrow.
Okay, so the workshop that we held in February here in New Orleans was ostensibly to discuss why we might want to have reference points for the Gulf Menhaden fishery. In part, this was an outcome of the CDAR review. The part of that review reached the conclusion that the deliberations on reference points to that point had been less than conclusive or less than satisfactory, and so there was sort of this remaining imperative to try to be able to move forward with an appropriate definition of reference points. We sort of framed that discussion of reference points around the sort of question of, if you're trying to manage a fishery, manage a resource, you need to know what you're doing it for in order to get to the question of what would be an appropriate set of rules to manage successfully. How do you gauge success? And so we talked at some length about what the objectives might be for the Menhaden fishery, and I'm going to share in my next slide with you where we ended up with that. we spent a fair bit of time at that meeting discussing the most recent benchmark assessment and what that said about the recent and historical status of the Menhaden fishery, put that in perspective. We're not going to be doing that at this meeting. And then we looked at the merits of different candidate or alternative reference points, and we discussed what the management implications might be of choosing a particular course of or pathway with regards to the development of reference points. The other thing I should mention, it's not on this slide, is that this was all, I think, importantly in the context of the desire of the Menhaden industry to achieve Msc certification, and that one of the criteria for Msc certification, to oversimplify it a little bit, is that there are reference points in place that are used to inform decision making with respect to the fishery. So this is in no small part motivated by that. So as I said, we spent a fair bit of time discussing the objectives for the fishery, and we kind of went around the room and everybody contributed their thoughts on that. And this is kind of my attempt to sort of summarize what I would refer to as the fundamental objectives that we identified. And when I refer to a fundamental objective, I mean something that you are seeking to achieve because you value it, not because it is a means to some other end that you value. And so the fundamental objectives here that we sort of talked about were balancing the needs of the fishery and the needs of the ecosystem within which the fishery operates to ensure long-term sustainability. Another fundamental objective was that all user groups would accept shared responsibility for maintaining and improving ecosystem health, population abundance, and biodiversity, and that all partners and the general public have confidence in the sustainability of the fishery in the industry and in management. So these are objectives that are kind of, if you will, fundamental to a collective sense that the fishery is being managed and operating in a way that is acceptable to stakeholders. And then there were a whole series of what I refer to here as means objectives, which, just like the word implies, are things that would kind of you would need to accomplish in order to achieve those fundamental objectives. So making sure there's an adequate spawning stock biomass to ensure that the recruitment continues to be high, minimizing negative effects on predators and on habitat, minimizing bycatch, maintaining a sustainable commercial fishery, and so on down the list. And these means objectives, to no small part, reflect the diverse interests of different constituents with respect to the Menhaden fishery and the ecosystem within which it operates. So those objectives were kind of identified and agreed upon, and then we kind of set those aside and focused the rest of the discussion at that workshop on how we might go about deriving a set of appropriate reference points for this fishery. And where we kind of ended up, and again, I'm compressing 2 full days of lots of discussion and lots of back and forth into a few bullets here, but one of the main things that we concluded was that we wanted to focus, in the near term at least, on the development of what I'm referring to as empirical reference points. So there had been quite a lot of thinking for Gulf Menhaden about whether some of the reference points that have been presented in the literature, a lot of them based on the theory of fishing and the theory of fish population dynamics, could be used to define reference points for Menhaden. And the bottom line was that they were lacking, their utility was not demonstrable to us. And so instead, we explored the idea of developing reference points that are empirical, based on basically framing your question around desiring a future for the fishery and the fish stock that is at least as good as the characteristics of the stock in the past that you judged to be good. Okay, so sort of maintaining a healthy fishery by looking at what defined a healthy fishery in the past and using that to define your reference points. We also agreed, based on some preliminary work that you're going to hear about a little bit later, that it would make sense to use this management strategy evaluation methodology to evaluate how well different possible empirical reference points might perform in the future based on our understanding of how the fish population dynamics and the fishery operate presently. And that's what we're going to be spending our time. At that point, we had some preliminary work done. There was kind of a proof of concept, I would argue, at that point, and the agreement was that that would be the next step, would be to take that proof of concept and build a more comprehensive management strategy evaluation or set of analyses to inform this question. And we agreed that there would be a group of modelers, analysts that would proceed to do that. Several members of that group are here today. Not all members of the group were able to join us today. But we also said, let's not rule out the possibility that at some point in the future, we might want to revisit other possible bases for defining reference points, particularly reference points that might be informed by a greater understanding of how Menhaden fits into the Gulf of Mexico ecosystem in the future. We spent quite a lot of time at the February workshop sort of talking about what we understood about Menhaden and some of the food web modeling work that had been done. I think it would be fair to say that the end point of that discussion was that there's still more work to be done there. It doesn't really, the body of work is not mature enough to really point us to reference points yet, but we don't want to rule out that possibility in the future. And so we left room for further consideration of how reference points might be informed by a ecosystem scale analysis of the fishery in the future. The analysis that you are going to see in the next day is not of that nature. It is really a population level analysis of the fishery and for the most part. Okay, so I think that's for later. So that's sort of my overview. There are lots of other people who are here. If anybody wants to chip in, Chad, I think you had a comment or a question.
Yeah, just going back to that last point on the ecosystem modeling. I note that Dave Scaris isn't here, so I take it he's not here because there's nothing new to present or to include. But in talking with him recently, it seems like it's getting fairly close. And I think what we came out of the last meeting, at least my impression was that he would be perhaps ready to put something together for the the fall commission MAC meeting, Menhaden board meeting. I'm just wondering if that's still in the hopper and that's something that's still on the list. Okay.
But that's their model.
Microphone.
I'm sorry. Joe and I are the only ones on the webinar so far. So Steve Vanderkoy, Gulf States. We are planning to have them make the presentation at the fall during the MAC meeting. And that's their modeling approach, looking at a variety of predator and prey to try to get at the trophic level interactions in the Gulf. And he has been contributing to this. He's not here because he's been on travel and was unable to attend, but he was on the invitee list and we were intending him to come. He just couldn't make it.
Amy, I'm wondering if I could put you on the spot a little bit here, and if you don't feel comfortable doing this, that's totally fine. But I know that, and this definitely was part of our discussions at the February meeting, that Dave has been a pretty key player in discussions about reference points, ecosystem-based reference points for Atlantic Menhaden. And I believe in a casual conversation that you and I had day before yesterday or yesterday, that you're kind of close to some sort of new insights or synthetic results for Atlantic Menhaden. Can you speak really briefly to that? Or have I really put you on the spot?
It's okay. So Amy Schuler, No Fisheries. As far as Atlantic Menhaden go, right now we're at the very sort of report writing and final modeling point to move forward with recommendations, or at least a suite of plausible target recommendations for the management board to consider on the Atlantic coast. And those are going to be put together in a document and sent for review, external review through CIE in the beginning part of November. And so, this process for Atlantic Menhaden has been years in the making. And Dave has a sort of stripped down, sort of minimum sufficient complexity EWE model that he is preparing and using, and we're providing results from for that. That being said, I think that on the Gulf, he is working on a model, but it hasn't necessarily gone through sort of the kicking of the tires and the things that need to happen for the process part of it, and then an external review on the Gulf. It's sort of in that beginning stages. And so on the Atlantic side, we're much further along. And where that will go once it's reviewed and how it's reviewed, and then it's presented to the management board next February, I was just saying, I don't have a crystal ball, so we'll see.
Sure, yeah. I thought it might be helpful to share that because at just the point that it's been a lot of work to get to where you are now, that it's not done, and it's further along than the thinking that has been brought to bear for this fishery. None of which is to say that it's not a good idea to continue to pursue it, but just not to sort of elevate expectations about how close I think Dave or the modelers are to really being able to give good answers, solid answers. Go ahead, Amy.
So from the Atlantic perspective, just to give a timeline on this ecosystem reference point perspective really got pushed, I would say, starting in 2012. It made it into a term of reference for the 2014/15 assessment, but that wasn't sufficient time to get many of the multi-species models up and running and appropriately vetted. And so basically 2012 to 2019 has been, and mostly we've been working on it from 2015 to now. So it's a lot of years and commitment and time, and really the murmurings of ecosystem reference point for Atlantic Menhaden preceded 2012, but that was when the big term of reference and push started to be, at least on paper.
Any other questions about the background? Yes, Chad.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't mean to belabor this, but
it's important.
I've been involved with lots of meetings and processes where things come presented from the science side, and they leave that meeting and nothing happens after that. In Atlantic, and obviously Amy's going to know better than I, but they have a subset of group that is looking at the ecosystem modeling or reference point working group. And here at the Gulf, obviously there's lots of things that are different. They have a technical committee that looks at their Menhaden stuff. I guess maybe the MAC is somewhat similar to that, but I guess where I'm going with that is maybe not now, but in the process of this week and in that next board meeting when Dave's presenting, think about a process that might have formulate a technical working group that would look at ecosystem reference points and whatever comes out here, like a technical group that would monitor or help advise or discuss those types of processes that can feed into the Menhaden fishery. Because usually the stop right off the assessment goes right to the Menhaden board, and there's no in between usually, other than maybe a CIE review for benchmark. So it might be something worth thinking about is having some insertion of a technical group that could look at those types of modelings.
Sort of designed from both the good and the bad experiences of the Atlantic Menhaden group, right? Yeah.
Okay. And maybe that'll force Dave to get to these meetings.
Peter.
Yes, Peter Himchak, Omega Protein. I thought the major result coming out of the workshop was that we had a lot of discussions, and we discussed the reference points that were used in the 2 benchmark assessments for Gulf Menhaden, and found problems with using both options. And I don't want to say by default, because the index-based reference point concept was presented. Yes, it won out in by default because the others we considered as useless, but we did like the concept of the index-based reference points, and we recognize that it is a new management mechanism and needed further development. And I think since that workshop, there has been significant development. So that's my take.
Yeah, I would agree. It was sort of the only approach left standing after we looked at the other ones at this point, given what we know now. Yeah, which is not to say that it's the only approach that would ever have merit. Yeah. Chad?
Yeah, and I wasn't sure when I should ask this question, bring this up, but it's my understanding that, yes, there was some concurrence on the index-based approach, but that this technical group would be also looking at other alternatives, SSB-related alternatives, more directly that are more correlated with the stock assessment model outputs. But that doesn't, I'm not sure where that's at, if that was looked at and dispensed. So I want to, hear about that technical work and that group's activities to see what happened with that, because that was my expectation, that there's going to be more than one approach looked at. Okay, yeah. Well, I think that's a question that would make sense for you to revisit after you've sort of seen what has been done. Yeah, very good. Any other comments or questions about the reflection on the February workshop and where we're got to at that point? All right. So this is kind of self-evident. I've already said this. This is kind of our goal for today, tomorrow, and Friday morning, is to review the work that has been done by this technical group, critique what has been produced, make suggestions for refinements if refinements are needed, and so on and so forth. That's our primary purpose over the next 48 hours. And that would lead us on the agenda to thinking about what we mean by management strategy evaluation. So I'm relieved that the star of the show is back in the room at this point. But so Doug, unless you want to have, if there's any preamble, we can just go ahead and cue up the Pew video, or would you like to say a few remarks before we do that?
Yeah, Doug Butterworth, thanks. I think not. Let's rather have the video first and let me embellish rather than the other way around. Yep. Otherwise, we might have repetition. Thanks.
Very good.
Steve Vanderkooy's computer.
In essence, harvest strategies amount to agree the rules before you play the game. Essentially, they are just an elaboration of what became evident from the fairly disastrous collapses of the major pelagic fisheries in the 60s and 70s of the last century, where the post-mortem examination said the problem really was every time action needed to be taken, an argument would be found to say, let's just put it off one more year in the hope things get better. What harvest strategies are doing is they're saying, no, you set up the rules first and then you stick to the rules, because if you don't have that situation, when you get into trouble, the action that's taken is too little too late. MSE stands for Management Strategy Evaluation, and in essence what it is saying is use computer simulation testing to check out the rules you plan to apply to a fish stock before you actually go out there and apply them. In other words, make sure that they're going to work before you try them out. The great advantage of management procedures is they specify beforehand what the rules will be for setting the TACs. So you don't get unnecessary debate and changes that make no effective benefit for the stock concerned. From the manager's point of view, then, the advantage is a quick and simple way of getting agreement on what the TAC recommendation is going to be. As far as the industry is concerned, it actually gives them greater security because they have an idea of what's going to happen and they're not left to suffer the vagaries of a debating process around what is the best assessment for this year. So in the longer run, we get better management of the resource. A great advantage of management procedures is they provide a structured approach to deal with uncertainty that the conventional assessment procedure does not. And they look for what is called robustness. What it means is that even if you've got it wrong as regards what is the resource doing, how does it behave, the formula you use to set the catches will still provide reasonable performance. That means it will still provide, not exactly, but fairly close to the level of catches you'd have expected, and more particularly, it will still secure you against levels of depletion of the resource that you want to avoid. There is the concern that harvest strategies tie the hands of managers, but I think this is ill-placed because it fails to recognize that it is the managers who are choosing the harvest strategies in the first place. The responsibility of the scientists is to present a range of harvest strategies and, importantly, also the implications of each of those harvest strategies. What is critical, though, is the managers, having accepted the rules, must be prepared to stick by the rules as they play the game. The progress has been slow, but slowly one is seeing an expansion of these activities. If you go back 10, 15 years, perhaps you had application in no more than 1 or 2 countries and 1 or 2 RFMOs. Now that is expanding. It's particularly expanding in the tuna RFMOs, where originally there was only the CCSBT, the Commission for the Conservation of Southern Bluefin Tuna, which led the way and put a management procedure in place some years back. But the other tuna RFMOs have accepted that they need to go the same way, and the implementation of at least some management procedures has either happened very recently or is imminent.
Doug Butterworth again. Just to pick up briefly from this and taking account of Chad's earlier questions as well, I think it's useful to point out both the commonalities and the differences between the conventional assessment approach to coming up with catch limits and the management procedure approach. It isn't that management procedures ignore assessments. In fact, the assessments are the basis of the simulation tests that are used to come up with the formulae that are used to set catch limits, what are called the management procedures themselves, which are no more than, at the end of the day, catch limit formulae. Where the problem came up, and to give a little bit of the history of this, where did the whole idea come from? It really came from the problem of uncertainty, and in a context of a highly topical and, what shall I say, contested issue in the 1970s going into the 1980s to do with whaling and what sort of limits were sustainable. And essentially, to cut a lengthy story short, in the mid-70s, the Whaling Commission, well in front of many of the other international groups, had put in place the equivalent of reference points. And 10 years later, it came to the conclusion they weren't working because what they had was a catch control rule. It had implicit in it reference points, but what brought the whole process to its knees was uncertainty. That when you have an assessment, it's always debatable exactly what the best assessment should be. And even if you agree on the best assessment, there are always uncertainties. And the motivation behind the whole approach was it wasn't good enough just to base your decisions on your best assessment, even if you could agree to that, even if you could agree to the reference points. What you had to do, and it was brought up briefly in that video, was have a look at what were the consequences of applying that approach, even if you got it wrong. You wanted to guarantee that you were so-called robust against uncertainties. So, yes, you are still dealing with reference points when you come to management procedures. It's not quite the same as the conventional assessment approach, which talks about particularly target as well as limit reference points. The limit reference points are certainly still there in the management procedures, the management strategy evaluation. The key thing always, and in every case I can think of, the primary concern is the resource. The whole point is make sure you don't, through harvesting, take the resource lower than you'd want to do so and put the future at risk. When it comes to targets, though, the nuance is slightly different because the emphasis is on trade-offs rather than necessarily on specific targets. And one tends to say, let's have a rule, because there'll always be some trade-off involved, as long as you protect yourself against certain extreme results for the resource, and I should also say some extreme results for the fishery, because the fishery is also important from a risk point of view. You then look, because you can't optimize everything at the same time. You cannot have maximum possible catches at the same time of having minimum possible risk. The two don't go together. Essentially, you have to have trade-offs, and within certain, what shall I say, necessary, I've forgotten the phrase, but certain indisputables, I haven't got the word right quite there, but levels below which thou shalt not go. You do have that underlying it all, but within that, what I might call within the limit reference point idea, the emphasis is more on trade-offs than on targets. So the ideas are common, but there are important nuances that, in going from one to the other. The management procedure approach, I think, takes you beyond the conventional assessment, particularly because it takes the uncertainties into account in a much better way. And, but don't think you're deserting the assessments. The assessments are what underlie the basis you use for testing the rules. Right. So I hope that helps a little bit, and happy to take questions. Thanks.
Yeah, there's one piece of that I'd like to follow up on, but does anybody else have any questions for Doug before I throw something else up? I wanted to see if I can connect the dots, as I understand it, between your earlier observation, Chad, and what Doug was just talking about, because my sense is that what you were referring to in terms of your recollection of the earlier meeting was that we would be considering, in addition to using the survey indices as a basis for defining reference points, we would also use, I think you were saying, like assessment results, in other words, estimates of the status of the spawning stock biomass or something like that, as opposed to the survey indices. Does that fairly reflect the distinction that you were talking about?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. And to see and discuss what the correlation is between the two. And I think we'll get, once we start diving into the details,
we'll
of
see
the
a bit of
technicality.
that.
We'll start
Yeah.
having those conversations. So I'll
But
hold off.
I kind of just wanted to clarify that, Doug. I think the main thing he was referring to was the discussions we had about, there was some discussion about whether these survey indices were reliable or vulnerable to being misleading or so on, and that maybe a measure that is an output of the assessment model, spawning stock biomass or something like that, would be a better metric to use for your reference point than the index itself. That was a discussion that we had at the meeting. So I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Thanks, Doug Butterworth. And one has to be careful here not to dive into too much detail, but just to try to get some of the issues across. The first point is what you will almost certainly use in your management procedure as your indexes in the control law, particularly if it's an empirical control law, is the information that has the most impact on the assessments. And for all the extra data that go into assessments, the reality is what controls them is the indices of abundance. And when you look at sensitivities to the results of the assessments, things like changes in the length distribution of the catches and so forth, they play a role, but the role is minor. What really drives the trends, and that's what's important from the point of view of managing the resource, is the index of abundance. So that's why in this case you'll see it's the indices of abundance, the ones that are used in the assessment, that have also been picked to drive the procedure.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first point. They're not that, you're not expecting great differences. But also conventionally, and we'll come to this in more detail when we discuss exceptional circumstances towards the end of the story. I mentioned earlier that a management procedure is like an autopilot. But equally well, it's not an autopilot like the light rail, where it's run without a train driver. It's an autopilot like in a plane, where the pilot doesn't leave the plane, and the pilot watches over the autopilot. And the way you watch over the autopilot will come to some specifics later, but also it's quite often the case that as a checking mechanism to make sure things are on track, that the assessment is routinely updated every year. It's sometimes called the turn the crank assessment, which is not going into the whole benchmark assessment approach of zero-based budgeting and starting from the beginning again. It's the turn the crank assessment is saying we'll take the approach we used last year, and the only thing we'll do different is we'll add one more year's worth of data, and we'll see whether we're getting out of sync or not. And that's a diagnostic, among others, that is used to tell you, are you keeping on track? Sometimes that doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen simply because resources in this world are stretched. So not everything gets done. Part of the intent of this approach was, in fact, to save on resources, though it's heavy duty to get it in place. Once you've got it in place, you want to have it operating most of the time in autopilot mode. But you do have these annual diagnostics, number one, and one of those can be the turn the crank assessment update. The second point, and I'll just mention this briefly now and hold it at this stage because we can get into more details later under the so-called exceptional circumstances heading. The other point to bear in mind is once you have this procedure, this formula, it's not like the law of the Medes and the Persians, which once written shall never be altered. It is something you look at again on typically a timeline where my experience is it's something from 4 to 9 years, depends on the resource and so forth. Typically 5 is a good average. And so I don't think that if you accept something, it is therefore written in absolute stone. It's only written in that stone for the next 5 years, and then you'll re-chisel it. So it's not a process that is intended to take you away from the assessments. They'll be important as diagnostics, and they are fundamentally important to the whole process to get it going, because it's the assessments you use as the bench, as the foundation to do the simulation testing. So I hope that helps for the moment. At a greater degree of detail we can probably more effectively discuss in corridors, but just to set the scene, I hope that helps.
I made a note up here. I think something that would be worth doing, and Doug kind of alluded to this in his remarks, is that he made the observation that the indices tend to drive the assessment. And you said, well, it'd be interesting to look at how they correlate. So I just made a note of that. And maybe that's something, I don't know whether, Amy, you could pull that up at some point, not right now, but basically just look at the correlation between this J index that we've developed and the actual assessed abundance to see how much what's the right redundancy there is in that. It might be helpful for you to think about that. We have another person that has joined us at the table. So Kendall, I'm going to kind of persuade you to introduce yourself.
Yep, sorry. Couldn't be helped, but I'm Kendall Dix. I'm from Healthy Gulf. Is there anything else I was supposed to
I think
disclose?
That's fine. Yeah, thank you. You're going to have to bear with. We're not going to go all the way around the room and have everybody else introduce themselves.
I think I know almost everyone else.
There is a sign-up sheet somewhere. Yeah. You've got. You're good. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? What I'm going to ask, Doug isn't off the hot seat yet, because the next thing I would like to do then is to take a look at what work was done that kind of got us to the discussions of management strategy evaluation at the February workshop. So sort of the preliminary MSc work. I think that'll help us to frame questions that we will have both about the work that's been done since as well as that work. And really what you heard from the video and Doug's comments, in my view, is sort of that 10,000 foot perspective on MSc, why it's a useful tool, what it helps us with. And I think this presentation or a summary of that, the work that we talked about at the February workshop, will really kind of translate that sort of conceptual attractiveness into what it really looks like for our fishery. So are you comfortable with that, being given back the floor for that?
Thanks, Doug Butterworth again. And what I'm going to ask Steve to do is pull up on the screen our paper from January,
right,
which was what was picked up there. Yeah. And I'd just like to allude to a few points in there, not to get into the details, but more to try to point the way towards the next point in the agenda is, and what did we do after that and why? Perfect. So the first important points here are under the introduction. There are really two key paragraphs here, which is said, why are we doing this? And the first point is the one of Msc certification. For those of you who may not be aware, but I think most people are aware, MSc is not MSE, it is Marine Stewardship Council. And certification by the Marine Stewardship Council is becoming an increasingly important issue for many fisheries for two reasons. One is market advantage, which is the way it's sold, but there's also another reason that's important, and that is the way the world is working. In many places, if you don't have MSc certification, you won't even be allowed entry into the market. So it is becoming increasingly important for fisheries. We won't divert into a debate about the desirability, the positives, the negatives of this, but it's a fact of life. And
there's also, if I might, there's also some evidence that has been reported that MSc certification has led to better outcomes for fisheries.
Yes, I certainly would not, Doug Butterworth again, I would not disagree with that statement. In fact, I've been an advocate for that very reason, that even before you go to the outcome, I would say minimally, over the last 10 years since MSc certification took off, and because it was in the doldrums in its first decade, it took off in the mid-2000s. And really what one's found in many places is it forced the science to be taken much more seriously. And I think that has been indirectly one of the chief achievements of the process for all the other, both positives and negatives about it. But leaving that aside, one of the key things about Msc certification has been the requirement that there is a harvest control rule in place of some form. Now, let's not worry about the details of that. It's more the motivation behind that. It links up exactly with the point that was made in the video. And that point of mine wasn't original. Some of you are, is it old enough, young enough to have heard the name Alec McCall? Anyone? It does ring some bells here. For those of you who know Alec McCall, Alec was the one who dealt originally with some of the California sardine problems and was one of the experts there. And he was the one who came up with that soundbite, essentially agree the rules before you play the game. That the problem with all the pelagic collapses, and that's when I came into the game in the 1970s, and Alex was around there too. The experience was exactly as I related there, and that was in part quoting Alex. The problem was people took action too little too late, and for heaven's sake, agree what you're going to do so that when a nasty happens, you agree that that's what you're going to do and it's going to be adequate, rather than the other side of the coin of when the nasty happens, then you start bickering about what you're going to do, and inevitably you don't do the action you take is too little too late. So that's the origin of that, and that's what's behind the harvest control rule idea. We've got a variant of that we'll come to here, but the idea is particularly if things are getting bad, you have got an agreed action in place that if, and a basis to take it, an agreed basis to take it, that if it gets that bad, we're going to take this action, which we've already checked out will be sufficient for the circumstances. So that basically is what's behind there. And that's important from the point of view of Gulf Menhaden, because at the moment there's nothing in place. It's officially, that's not to say there isn't there are problems at the moment. From the point of view, at least of a single species fishery. I'll come to the multi-species aspect in a moment. But as you know from the assessment, the basic situation is not overfished and no overfishing. And basically, this is a resource which, compared to many other resources, is large and is underexploited, if I can put the words that way. But that doesn't mean that you can be guaranteed that that's going to continue, because Mother Nature turns up some nasties, and you've got to be in a position where you're prepared to deal with those nasties if they occur, not just assume they're not going to occur at all. So that's the first objective here that we're trying to address with this. It's developing a harvest control rule, and I'll come to the details of that a bit later, because it's not quite of the nature one generally has, but it still has that important property of if things get bad, we've got a rule that says what we're going to do to reduce the impact of the resource, to try to make those things get better, particularly from the resource point of view, but of course always taking the fishery considerations into account. Often the word risk only gets used with respect to the resource. There's a risk with respect to the fishery for the people who get their employment from the fishery as well, and that's got to be factored in too. But then the second point is the ecosystem consideration. And what we are dealing with here is a short-term shortcut, if I put it that way. One isn't trying to say here we're solving the problem once and for all. One is admitting to the fact that this is a work in progress, that there will be further analyses put on the table, but the nuance of this, and I'm just going to go, now I've got to remember to tell Steve to do what I'm doing. Steve, can you please go to, in this paper, since this is the one we've got up, I want to have a look at, now I've got to find it. Sorry, just finding my way around my own document. Okay, let's go to the page, Steve, is page, help me if I had page numbers on here, page 8 of the document. It's figure 4, and I want to go to the second one down on the left. So here I've got to remember our instructions that some of the people listening can't hear what we're doing. So when I put a pointer on the screen, I've got to explain what I'm doing as well. So those here, please, I'm not being condescending. It's just I've got to take into account that some people listening can't see what's on the screen and quite what we're doing. But here we have, from the last baseline assessment or base case assessment, the time trend in, we've called it spawning stock biomass. It's really egg production, but it's quicker to say spawning stock biomass. Everyone's so used to that. And that is the trend we've seen from the mid-70s through to the current point in time. And it has its highs, it has its lows, and in particular, that's the lowest it was. Now I'm going to make an assertion which some people may have reservations, but nevertheless, I'd argue that it is a way forward for the moment, pending more work on the ecosystem. And here I'm getting a glorious, thanks for your red dot, put the red dot where I've got the green pointer. Thank you. Okay, so what we're pointing out there is the lowest value of spawning biomass that we've seen over the last, 30 years. And the idea was that at least as I understand the situation, from an ecosystem point of view, there is not any definitive evidence that says over the last 30 years, the Menhaden fishery, the state of the Menhaden resource, not so much the fishery, but the state of the resource has been such as to cause any major deleterious ecosystemic consequences. So going from that point, one is then taking the next point up and say spawning stock biomass as good an index as any of the status of the resource, but provided we stay above the lowest level we had over the last 30 years, we are therefore, as a first approximation to dealing with potential ecosystem problems, we are going to be okay. Now, again, I stress this is not the final solution. There is work ongoing with ecosystem modeling and so forth. We'll allude to some of that in a moment when we come to what we have to be robust about. But one of the important results that came out in January, and let's not worry about the black lines for the moment in this projection, let's worry about the red lines. Basically what those red lines said, and sorry for those who are listening, I'm breaking my brief again. This plot is a plot of egg production, and it's a plot of the past egg production up to the stage of the assessment, and it's projecting forward using the procedures that are developed for the simulation studies. And we can go into details about those later. But what will happen, we've done two things in these projections. First of all, we've assumed that the recruitment fluctuations we've seen in the past will be, that we'll get in the future will be similar to the ones we've seen in the past. Secondly, as far as the fishery is concerned, we've said the fishery over the past 10 years has bounced around between 400 and 600,000 tons a year. And we've just said, assume we had no further restrictions and we carried on bouncing around between 400 and 600,000 tons a year, and recruitment fluctuated to the extent it's fluctuated over, in fact, the past 30 years. That's the median of what we'd expect, and these are the 80% probability range. In other words, this is the upper 10 percentile, that's the lower 10 percentile there. So for those of you who can't see the picture, it's essentially a fan where you have a median going out fairly flat, and you've got upper and lower ranges. Now, the important point about the lower ranges, and have we got the right plot here, Steve? Because I think it is, no, we have, sorry, my mistake. The important point about this is look at the red before you look at the black. And remember, this is circumstances where the future is going to be like the past. Now, one can't assume that as the only thing that can happen. I'll come back to that. But the key point, and can you hold 1 second and then I'll take a question. The key point about this is the red curve, which is even without any control rule, is saying without that control rule, we're very unlikely, not absolutely unlikely, but with 90% confidence, we're not going to drop below the lowest we've seen in the past. So you can make an argument that if the future continues to be like the past and the fishery continues in the future to be like it has over the last 10 years, there's no need for a control rule. We've got a control rule in here which has a small impact in this case. But last point, and then we'll take the question. The key point here is if we could consider the future is definitely going to be like the past on this, and that the baseline assessment was the baseline assessment, obviously it was the baseline assessment. The baseline assessment was the truth. There'd be nothing to worry about. But we can't assume that. And that's the question of uncertainties. And what I'm going to take you through in the next level of this is going to be the uncertainties we've considered. But I think this is a good point to stop. I've been holding my colleague on my right up for a long time. He wants to ask his question. Let me stop for the moment. Let's take some questions.
Yeah, this is Kendall from Healthy Golf. And I'm sorry if this has already been answered, but if so, could you refresh my memory on whether or not we have data before 1975?
From the Gulf Menhaden fishery.
Right.
Amy, can you speak to that? Thanks.
Sure, Amy Schuler. Yes, there are landings data and there are catch at age data. Those catch at age data are available starting in 1964, but they were censored prior to, I think the model here starts in 1977. That's when the assessment starts, is 1977. So there's documentation for that in the assessment report. There are not index data. So okay. I don't know if there's anything in particular you're interested in, but
no, I was just wondering,
the basics.
Just curious why the chart starts at 75.
Yeah, it has to do with when there were, I think maybe you could almost say it started when there were, in the opinion of the assessment scientists, sufficient information to inform an assessment. Other questions for Doug? Yeah, Chad.
Oh, can I ask a question of Amy?
Or you can ask a question of Amy, yes.
Well, it could be Doug too. Those that are deeply knowledgeable about the assessment, do we have any idea, and I apologize if I'm forgetting, what caused that decline? Is it pure fishery based, or is there environmental cues going on? And is there any signaling from the environment of what's...
You're referring to this decline?
Yeah, the decline to the lowest point, because over the last, that period of time, whatever that is, 5 to 10 years. And is there any, how much do we know of what in the environment, what's driving recruitment? And as far as is it salinity, temperature, freshwater input from, heavy rain in particular years? Is there any environmental signals that's driving recruitment? And is there, because one of my questions that I answered myself, I was sitting there talking, is if we're maintaining status quo between the 400 and 600 metric tons projecting forward, and that shows that the stock, the SSB would be slightly declining, coming to some equilibrium, but possibly, declining significantly or maybe even increasing. But that's playing off the cues from the average recruitment signal over time. So I guess it kind of sort of several questions in one. Do we know what's driving that recruitment signal to where we could start projecting that forward based on, some MSc type approach to see what recruitment may be doing, and just as an example, high water years versus low water years, if that's the signal, something like that.
Do you want to speak to that at all, Amy?
Maybe Robert should speak to that.
Yeah, he's next on my list.
The environmental component is.
He's next on my list.
I'll speak to it to say that there has been some work if you're particularly interested in environmental pieces, but the work is not provide a weight of evidence in one way or the other, meaning there's been stuff, for example, on Mississippi River and Atchafalaya River discharge that they did, and then they updated and it still looked good, and then somebody else looked at it and not so much. And actually, colleague and I looked at it again with this assessment and it didn't hold up. And so I don't think that there's any, in my opinion, very strong indicators out there that are available that we would be able to say, here's the legwork that's been done currently in the literature that shows there's this relationship that's reliable over time that we're therefore going to incorporate into this. And maybe folks have a different opinion around the table, but that's just my assessment of what I've seen or read thus far.
Yeah, more emphatically, I would say that there's a set of maybe 5 or 6 papers, and they're all saying fairly different things about the recruitment impacts of high discharge levels in wind and impacts on individual condition, which impacts fecundity.
Was there also some correlation with marsh availability and I thought there was a negative correlation with the availability of marsh. So as more marsh gets lost, there's a positive correlation with recruitment, something like that.
Again, this is a very reasonable thing to suppose, and I think if you look at the data available to quantify marsh from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you might be hard pressed to, find much.
Just to add to that, the data for in that time period are sparse. And so it's hard to go backwards. And as we're moving forward, we're getting more quantity and quality. So hopefully we can do things in the future. But it's hard to get a lot of the environmental pieces. It's hard to get them far enough back in time at the spatial resolution that you would need in order to make some of these inquiries.
Predicting fish recruitment is a pretty elusive task throughout, globally, not just for Gulf of Mexico menhaden.
Yeah. So I guess that steep decline that is more related to the feed.
I wanted to come back to that because the first question you asked, Chad, was do we have any idea what caused the low abundance of adult menhaden in that around whatever it is, about late 1980s or early 1990s? Is there any signal in the assessment models that would inform that? I think there's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem in that if the abundance is lower, the exploitation rates might be higher, but that doesn't necessarily mean the higher exploitation rates cause the abundance to go lower, right?
That was part of the discussion there was, did the high landings there cause that lower SSB or not, or were there other things at play? And right. Some things that could be at play where the landings are decreasing are changes in the plant distributions and vessel numbers and things like that, which are documented in the assessment. Mm-hmm. But then also there's habitat things going on and environmental things going on that the group discussed, and there's no, sort of silver bullet of, yep, that seems to be what was going on there. There's just a lot of hand waving, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm. You have a remark, Doug, and then Kendall?
Yeah, Doug Butterworth. A couple of things here. First, to the question of, what caused this low point here, and for those on the call, I'm pointing at the plot of SSB versus year and the minimum round about 1992 or wherever it is. But first of all, we should bear in mind that over the last 10 years, the catches have been lower than they were over this early period here. So there was a landing effect there. Also, when you go across here, and the plot I'm referring to here is recruitment against time, the assessment results suggest that during the 80s and leading up to the early 90s, there was a period of relatively lower recruitment than there was in the end of the 70s and as you went back into the 2000s. So you have a combination out of the assessment, which in a sense is a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you didn't have this, you'd start worrying about the assessment, but and whether that's self-consistent. But that minimum value is a consequence of both higher landings and lower recruitment. But as Amy, I think it was, said, which is chicken, which is egg, is a little bit questionable. The other thing, just to remark, to follow up on Mike on the elusive stock-recruit relationships, don't be hard on yourselves. The point is, the biggest graveyard in fisheries is on stock-recruit relationships that once put into predictive mode failed miserably. And I think the only general conclusion that's come out of a large amount of work, that I'm happy to be corrected, is the only general signal that's tended to work has been temperature, and it's tended to work at the end of the ranges. What you see, the point is, when you're dealing with a stock which is at the end of its temperature range, either too large or too small, you're almost self-evidently in a place where that species is struggling. It's struggling because it doesn't like the temperature, and therefore it's unsurprising that the temperature should have a large effect.
Right.
And that has been picked up, but it's about the only general rule that's come out of decades of work. The problem when you're dealing with something in the middle of its range, and I mean, I'm not quite sure what you say is the middle of the Menhaden range.
Yeah.
Anyway, the problem is there are a whole number of factors that can play a role, and it's just statistically extremely difficult to disentangle them. So, don't, the bottom line here is by all means keep looking at it, but be careful about putting your expectations too high. Thanks.
Kendall.
So if I could quickly summarize what I just heard, and I just want to hear if I'm correct on this, is that over a 7-year period, we lost about 2/3 of our spawning stock biomass, and we currently don't have a good idea about why that happened.
I would, yeah. I don't think, I don't know whether, I'll guess I'll react to that and see what other people do. I mean, I would phrase or frame this as, it depends on your scale of explanation. I mean, as Doug pointed out, I could say we know exactly why it happened. Recruitment was low for the period of years prior to the spawning stock biomass being low. So it happened because there wasn't enough recruitment to keep the spawning stock biomass up. But then that begs the question of why was the recruitment low?
Sure.
And eventually you're going to get to the point where you don't know what the answer is. So in a sort of a immediate sense, what you said is absolutely correct. Or sorry, in an ultimate sense, we don't know what. But on the other hand, I think you can look at this and you can say, well, and as Doug pointed out, if the recruitment hadn't declined prior to the spawning stock biomass declined and the landings hadn't gone up a lot, we would really wonder why the assessment was telling us what it is. But do you want a follow-up comment? Yeah, Chad?
So I'm not looking at, I can't tell, but it looks to me like the landings and the spawning mass, the SSB, are tracking the same year. Or is there a lag time after the landings occurred and then the following year the SSB dropped off?
So this is the, landings. That looks to me like it's about 1990, maybe 1991. And this looks to me like it's maybe 1 year later.
Mm-hmm.
Eyeballing it. Does anybody can affirm? Jason, did you have?
Yeah, Jason Adrian. I just wanted to ask a question of Amy. In that time period, do we not have it's not a good index of, we didn't have any recruitment indices, so is it the landings informing that mostly? The ages from the landings?
Well, I mean, it depends on exactly which years, and I I'm trying to remember what year each of the indices started. I can pull up the assessment document and look.
Why don't we let you look into that?
Look at what years those individual points are, but
right.
I mean, yeah.
So we got a couple of microphones on right now. Mary Ann, you've been asked, patiently waiting for a chance to say something, so I'm going to get you before Trevor.
Okay, thanks. So actually, maybe this isn't the right time for this, but since we're talking about landings and recruitment, I'm mostly interested in looking forward, especially since, our information doesn't go back that far if it starts in the 60s. So I guess my question is about looking forward. If we're not sure that it's environmental factors or landings, are we taking into account a potential increase in landings as aquaculture develops, as we get MSc certification for the Gulf Menhaden fishery? It's possible we'll see higher landings. Are we thinking about that as a factor in future recruitment in these predictions?
That's an excellent question, and I'm going to suggest that it's something that we will absolutely be drilling into as we move forward. So yeah, so we will, I mean, when we talk about what futures do we want to be able to consider as possibilities, that's something that we definitely should discuss. I want to try to keep brief because there's ice creams at the back of the room, and that's the all-important truth at the moment.
Then we definitely keep it brief, Doug Butterworth. The answer is, just keep that question on notice. We'll go on to it in more detail tomorrow, but basically the answer is yes, because we're coming up with a proposal that says, provided the fishery will put restrictions on if things get bad, but also it's conditional on the fishery, in the absence of those restrictions, continuing to operate along the lines it has operated in the last decade. And that has maximum catches associated with it. So if you start seeing catches that go outside that range, I'll just use this term, exceptional circumstances, which you'll see at the end of the agenda.
Right.
And that's where that sort of point comes up. So don't forget it. It'll come up later.
Trevor, did you have a comment you wanted to make before we break?
Yeah, just to follow up on the conversation we've been having for about the last 15 minutes, I think that was a time period in which we saw a lot of fluctuation in plants, and I'm sure industry can speak to that. We saw drop-offs. We saw new plants opening. We also saw increased activity in the tropics. So, for instance, I think a big one that everyone recognizes is that Hurricane Andrew came in 1992, which could have led to decreases in fleet. And if there were some changes in harvest or anything else, which you can see it's tracking pretty well with one another, that could explain that. But I think for the purposes of what we're doing today and the next couple of days, the assumption needs to be made that that's a point that we don't want to see this stock get back to. And how do we make sure we don't get back to that point?
Right.
So I think that's all I want to say.
Thanks, Trevor. Chad?
And I would also add that there's obviously a high amount of uncertainty about that data point and whether, in fact, there were no deleterious environmental or ecological effects that were occurring that were undetected. And that was a relatively short period of time. Had the landings stayed that high and the spawning stock biomass stayed low for a period of years, we might be seeing a different picture. So we want to stay, in my opinion, well above that line, as we talked about at length last meeting, because I'm not sold on the fact that that's the lowest point. I think the lowest point is higher than that, and especially considering we don't know a lot about the predator needs now. We certainly didn't know about the predators and their levels back then, but a lot of the fisheries were collapsed and were trying to be rebuilt, and a lot of overfished going on. I don't know what was going on with dolphins or other animals that were highly feed on Menhaden forage, but so there's a lot of stuff going on that's not captured in that. So there's a big range of uncertainty around that data point.
Yeah, and that's a good and an excellent thing to just sort of wrap up, because this really kind of ties back to the last main point that Doug made as he was working through that early report. Is he said, the premise that we're making using this empirical evidence is that this is giving us some sort of indication of a level of abundance that is plausibly associated with a reasonably healthy state. But there are, as you just said, there are plenty of plausible reasons to suggest that that might not be the case. And so, it is a starting point. And as you recall, we sort of talked about whether at that time was there other evidence that might help us to point to a level of spawning stock biomass that we would be even more confident was associated with a lack of ecosystem concerns. And we kind of felt, I believe we kind of felt like we didn't have an answer to that question. We're concerned about it, and that needs to be part of the conversation about what reference points are appropriate based on this. I think it would be fair to say that when you see the work that's been done since then, that all of the work that's been done is not locked into that point. I mean, part of the idea is let's now think about where we want to set our management levers or thresholds related to that. And so you'll get an opportunity to see that. As I said, there is ice cream at the back room. Do you have news on the this just in from the assessment models?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to tell everybody the years, so everybody. So the recruitment low point is 1991. The SSB low point is 1992. The landings low point is 1992. And then the SANE index does not start till 1996.
Okay. So it kind of stands to, it's encouraging that you would see the spawning stock biomass of a fish that matures at age 1 be at its low value a year after recruitment. That's reassuring. Okay, so there are refreshments at the back of the room. Let's take a 15-minute break and start up again just before 3 o'clock.
And I don't want to embarrass anybody in here. I'm CCA Government Relations Chair. And in Louisiana, and I'm on the national board. And I've always been interested in this. Where are you living?
I live in Michigan.
From our standpoint, this is a Louisiana issue. We're the nursery, we're the estuary.
Right.
This is a state issue.
Yeah.
And we're happy with these guys.
Yeah, good. That sounds good.
I think I've been there
My sense of control is starting to erode here. Come on, sit. It's not like you have anything important to talk about.
Trevor, John.
So just a wall here somewhere.
Circle wagons. Can I make one quick pitch?
You may, yeah. I was going to tell you to put that figure up, but I'm going to wait till Chad gets back for that. But do you want to wait? Go ahead and do it, Steve. Oh, yeah, no, I meant, sorry, go ahead and do your quick pitch.
Oh, my quick pitch.
Yeah.
All right, if everybody's coming back, just a nice little a freebie if y'all didn't see it, if y'all don't have a copy. This is now a fairly old book, The Men All Singing. It's a history of the Menhaden fishery, Atlantic and some Gulf. This is by John Fry. You probably know his brother Glenn in the Eagles. No? Different guy. So we have copies. We've had copies for years. I dug these out. I didn't know if anybody here had ever gotten one. Take a copy, please. I hate having them sit on a shelf. It's very interesting reading. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the fishery in the early 1900s on the Atlantic, Reedville, and it'll give you a real flavor for kind of where the industry has gone Very interesting. Lots of good pictures too. I like picture books.
All right. Just to follow up on a brief discussion we had earlier, Amy did pull out the from the assessment report the relationship between one of the indices, the GillNet index, and I assume the fecundity. That's an output from BAM, right? That so this is what Doug was referring to as the spawning stock biomass. And you can see, I think somewhere on here it says that, yeah, this is the R squared, or the R. That's the R value. So explaining about 65% of the variability in the GillNet index is explaining about 65% of the variability in the abundance index from the assessment model. So this is, I would just say, is simply an affirmation of what Doug was mentioning earlier, was that these, in a lot of stock assessments, these indices of abundance really have a large influence on your estimates of stock size. So that the implication of that is that a management strategy or management rule that was based on the assessed fecundity is not going to be drastically different from, in terms of what it does, to a management rule that's based on the index, because they're correlated. It's not going to be exactly the same, but it's not going to be drastically different. Okay? All right, so I think now we're going to continue on with Doug giving us, kind of catching us up on the work that informed our discussions at the February meeting, to set the stage for the work that has gone on since then, in anticipation of what we'll be hearing tomorrow. So the floor is yours again, Doug.
Sorry, I'm just making sure I get myself in the right place.
All right.
Doug Butterworth again, thanks. To start off where we had left off just before we broke, remember I'd said here, projecting forward under the assumptions that recruitment is similar to what we've seen in the past, that the fishery will behave as it has been behaving over the last decade, we see the range of results we might get, and this is upper 10%, lower 10% on a distribution. Oops, where's it gone, Steve? That's it. Even for the red curve, which is no limits on the fishery, we pretty much stay above the level which we consider problematic. Now, for those on the call, I'm looking at both the historic and the projected range for egg production, which we're calling spawning stock biomass for a shortened form. And what it's saying is the range of projections in the future is above the lowest point we've seen in the past. Now, when we come to the management strategy evaluation, I focused on that one had to consider not only what were the consequences if things stayed as they were, or if the best assessment was right, you had to consider the consequences also of what if one of those two was wrong. So just to give you the stage we got to in January, just because this paper in January was purely by way of illustration, let's move Steve down to the next figure, which is figure 5, and the corresponding plot. So again, it's the second one down on the left. And all of a sudden, those projections are nothing like what you saw beforehand. Whether you have the red, which is no control rule, or even the black, which is a control rule, you certainly go down low. Now, what is going on? What was done for these calculations that are different from the ones you've just seen? And what we did differently is something that's pretty extreme, given the stability of the recruitment in this fishery. But we said for the first 5 years we project, recruitment isn't from this pattern. Can you just move us slightly to the right, Steve?
I'm sorry, I'm working on
Okay.
something else.
Oh, okay. All right. That does it. What you'll see over here, instead of recruitment staying for the next 5 years in the range we'd seen in the past 30 years, it varies, but on average, it's only 50% of what it was for that period. Now, the problem is, after 5 years of 50% of what it was, damage is already done, because we're getting, for the technical people, we're getting the effect of then lower recruitment because the spawning biomass has been dropped too low. But the important point is back to further to the left, Steve, thanks. The important point here is we have to look at scenarios like this as well. Now, I'm not commenting at the moment over the plausibility of this scenario or not. You've got to be very careful, because no one has ever designed a rule that is perfect, whatever the circumstances. It can't be. There's got to be some common sense about the alternative scenarios you look at, and we'll come to that. But I just wanted to use this example to say not everything in the garden is rosy here. There are circumstances where either we've got the assessment wrong, or the future is not going to be like the past, and this is an example where the future certainly isn't like the past, where things would go wrong. And that is why we need rules to correct for them. You may notice here that if we have no rule here, it's pretty miserable. No one's going to be satisfied with the red outcome here. You can't help the resource coming down in these circumstances. I'll show you plots tomorrow which show it comes down whatever. There's only an envelope within which you can operate. But the key difference here, which makes a big difference from having a rule to not having a rule, is on the previous plot we didn't see very much difference. Here you see an enormous difference. If you keep on with no controls on the fishery, you end up in when this must be about 2040, you end up still highly depleted. If you have the control rule, sure, you do come down, and you come down, we'll come to, is that come down acceptable? But the one thing you can say there is the rule does turn you around, and the rule gets you back up to a reasonable level by the end of the period. Now, that comes at a cost. We needn't go into it at the moment. It comes at the cost of a radical reduction in catches. But that's the point of having these rules, that if something nasty happens in the future, you haven't seen it in the past, but at least you've got some rules in place which have the capability of turning around a situation so at least we got a turnaround there with the rule, whereas without the rule, we would have languished down at a level where both the fishery was wiped out and the stock was, well, neither completely wiped out, but both pretty miserable. If we can just go up to the landings, let's just go one up there. Look at what happens in the landings as well. Without the rule, the red curve, the landings went down. Now, they took a bit of time to go down. They went down because there just wasn't enough fish to catch. So even if you tried to catch at the level you'd been catching the last decade, you wouldn't have managed it. But the point is, without the rule, they took time before they started coming down. They were taking as much as they could. When the rule comes in, the catch starts dropping earlier, and so it goes down low, and it turns around. So you get back up at the end of the day, despite this, to a reasonable fishery and a reasonable state of the resource. If you don't have the rule, you've got neither a reasonable fishery here, because it's a pretty miserable catch, and probably at a level that would render the industry, by this stage, it would have gone uneconomic anyway, if not before. But at least you have a situation with the rule where both fishery and resource can be sustained in the long term, whereas if you don't have a rule and this happens, neither would apply. So let's not worry about the details for the moment. We'll come back to those tomorrow. I wanted for the moment to get across the point that if things don't carry on the way they have in the past, unless you have a rule, you can get into serious problems. That is the bottom line at this level, and that's by way of introduction to, and it will be time for Robert to take over in a moment on this, by introduction for what was done between the February meeting and this meeting here. This was just an example which we picked up at in this paper in January, which was illustrative. What we wanted to do over the intervening period was we put together a technical team, and Robert can talk about it, and we exchanged thoughts about what were a range of these sort of circumstances that we wanted to look at, the so-called robustness tests. And they're of two types. The first type is, what if the assessment was wrong? Now, those of you who remember details of the assessment know very well that Amy colleagues didn't just produce the results of one assessment, they produced the results of many, because there are different ways of doing the assessment, different assumptions you could make. So first of all, those alternatives give us alternatives to what might be the case rather than the sort of baseline assessment. So they're different interpretations of the data we have at the moment. And one wants to see if we change those interpretations, would our rule still be adequate? So that's line number one. What were the most important of those alternative assessments that Amy and colleagues did, and which ones should we look at here to see what impacts they might have? And also, with regard to the future, what happens in the future if maybe the assessment was perfect, but what happens if if circumstances change in the future and we get different circumstances? Now, it's easy to envisage all sorts of different circumstances, but there has to be, as I said, a degree of reasonability and judgment in this, that what we want, both with the alternative assessments and with the alternatives assumption going forward, satisfy a word that is easily spoken and much less easily defined or to put into practice, and that is they must be plausible. That easily runs off the tongue. We don't want to worry about having rules that are forced to work in circumstances which we don't consider plausible anyway, so who cares? We do want to look at how well do our rules work if we have circumstances that are different from what we assumed in our base case and are still plausible. And we'll debate later about how plausible was this poor recruitment. But the task of that group, and Robert will go into that after we've taken questions here, I'm just dealing with the concepts for the moment, but the task of that group was to come up with a set of such tests which spanned both possible alternative assessments and also possible alternative assumptions for the future. So leave it at that and let's take questions.
Chad and then Kendall.
Yeah, can you remind me on when do you turn the rule on? And that landings graph was showing that steep decline, then that the rule turned on and it brings the landings back up and the biomass back up, or the SSB back up. So how does that process work again? Like, how are you? At what point do you implement the control rule, i.e., the catch limit?
I'll be brief with that answer because we're going into the details later, and I don't want to get ahead of myself. But basically, the rule has a threshold. What it's saying is it's taking a combined index for the resource, and it's a combination of the two indexes you have. So it's a weighted combination, and I won't go into all the details of that, but basically it works off that. If you're above the threshold, there's no limitation on the fishery. Once you drop below the threshold, it drops as a straight line to zero. If the index went to zero, it's zero. And in fact, I can, just to give you a taste of that, get Steve into action again. Let's just have a look at Steve on page 6, the upper part of plot 2. I don't want to get into all the details of this for the moment. I just want to give you the context. So a bit further up, Steve, go on to page 6.
Oh, this one?
Oh, the one you put, yeah, okay, you've drawn pretty lines on. Okay, don't worry about Steve's pretty line.
Okay, I'll come back to that later, and I'll explain the data later. It'll be better in the plots we'll show you tomorrow. But this is the issue here. If that index falls below 0.8, well, first of all, if the index is above 0.8, don't worry about the details of this. Just what it is a weighted average of the two indices you got, and it's actually averaged over a couple of years. But if you're above that, the fishery carries on as normal. And as normal for the over this period, there's a bit of a problem with these dots here. But basically, that's the range over which it took catches over that last 10-year period. So there are no limitations on the fishery. Don't get into all the sort of technical problems that to which that gives rise. But the moment you drop below this level, a limit is imposed, and the landings for that year cannot exceed that limit. So if you're just below in this example, if you go just below 0.8, you're going to be told you can't take more than 400,000. If this goes down to about 0.4, it is around about 200. You can't take more than 200. So that's essentially the limit, and that's the rule that's playing out. If you go back down now, Steve, to the, I think it was figure 5, a few pages down, the one we were looking at, but further down, that's 3, that's 4, that's next one's 5. Let's just a little further up. That's the rule that's playing out here to pull down the catches there. We start from there, and you see immediately the, well, what happens, there's a little bit of a hiatus before there's a difference between the red and the black curves going into the future. The reason is twofold. Number one, you're starting off in a good place, and number two, there's a bit of a delay in the way the rule operates. We'll come back to that later. But what you see there is after a few years, the black line starts dropping rapidly, and that's with the rule, to the red line, which is dropping, and it's starting to drop because it's there. It's just struggling to make the catches. But nevertheless, it makes the catches if it can. When the control is in place, it's saying that's not good enough. We've actually got to put a forced limitation on the amount you can take. And you see that line comes down rapidly because by that stage, the resource is also coming down rapidly. So it's reacting to the signal. So does that help you for the moment, Chad? We'll pick up going further. And
then Charlotte, you have a question?
Yeah, so this is Kendall from Healthy Gulf. I just want to know what I'm again, like what I'm looking at here. Was any of the modeling done in terms of if there was already a rule in place, whether or not some of this precipitous decline would have been prevented, or do any of these lines represent if there was already a sort of a catch limit in place?
Doug Butterworth again. Yeah, what we must be clear on here is this is complex. So forgive me if for some I'm repeating things, because for others it's first introduction and it's difficult. What we have in this plot here is, remember, this is a situation where there is this nasty with recruitment, unlike the previous plot where there wasn't. And basically we're here, at the moment, we're here in terms of catches or landings, and we're here in terms of spawning biomass. So spawning biomass is quite healthy at this term. It's way above that. And what happens, because of the poor recruitment, spawning biomass starts coming down. Now,
but the rule is in place at that point.
Yes, the rule is put in place at that point. There wasn't any rule before then. But the contrast between the red line and the black line is the black line is the rule in place. The red line is no rule in place. And you may say, with no rule in place, why does the catch come down? Because, and forgive me for being a bit technical now, we'll get into more details of it tomorrow. We also allow for the fact that there's, with fishing mortality, most of you should be familiar with the term, there's a maximum fishing mortality that the industry can impose. Now, the industry, it can't quite catch everything that's all there. Some of you are familiar with the term fishing mortality from other sources, and we impose a maximum fishing mortality, which is a little bit bigger than the biggest fishing mortality the industry has ever had in the past. So that is why the red rule, which is no catch limit, it still comes down, because in circumstances where the resource is declining, the industry can't catch what it would like to catch anyway. But if that's all you have in place, as we saw over here, you end up with a miserable result. You don't turn it around. If you put your rule in place, now the rule's been in place from here, you only start to see the divergence a few years later, because remember, the rule only comes into play when you drop below the threshold. So even though the rule's there, the rule presumably wasn't activated until a few years down the line, because it takes time to pick up the fact, we know because we set up the simulation that recruitment was poor. But the data don't tell you that, because the data are noisy. So those factors are playing out. But the main point is, have I answered your question? Are you clear about where the rule is and isn't coming into play?
Well, so I guess I understand that this is the model for after the rule has already been activated. And I guess my question was there a simulation in terms of where before the precipitous decline there was already a rule? Or I guess maybe what I'm asking is, which one of these lines represents traditional fisheries management? If the fishery had already been managed like a lot of other fisheries in the Gulf, where you already had catch limits in place, is there a simulation about how this precipitous decline would or would not have happened?
Maybe I'll just, so the way these models work is that what's happened up until the present time. So this point here, where all the lines start to move apart, right up there, is the present time, right? So the model is not changing how management occurred in the past. What it's doing is it's saying what would happen in the future if management changed today. And so that is essentially a forecast of what will happen if the rule is in place right away. Because of the nature of the rule and the nature of the data, the reaction doesn't necessarily happen right away, because it might take, depending on the nature of the rule, it might take a couple of years before the signal is observed by the decision maker to change the rule. But the rule is in place. It's not like they wait for the signal to put the rule in place, but the rule doesn't have any effect until the signal tells it to have an effect. I don't know if that's just adding further confusing you, but it isn't. This is a case where the rule is in place at the very beginning of the simulation. So there is no point here where you could sort of say, well, if we put the rule in place a little earlier, maybe we would have done better. That's not really on the table in this analysis.
Okay, and so which line? The red line is the one that represents.
The red line represents no rule. Yes, correct.
And so this is saying 2019. We institute a total allowable catch.
Right.
And that's the
outcome is the black line.
The black line.
Yeah, the solid black line. That's the average outcome, essentially.
Okay.
I have a question and then a follow-up question after it. So this is based on 10 years of bad recruitment, and has that 10 years of bad recruitment, is that the worst case scenario? Has it happened before?
No.
I guess, how did you determine that?
Was it 10, Doug, in this case? I thought it was 5.
I'm trying to remember whether this result is 5 or 10, but the point is, let's not even bother my finding that, because the point is what's behind the question. What's behind the question is very important. And let me just, because we'll just touch on this now, because we'll come back to it tomorrow again, because this is fairly central. Now, again, I want to pick up where I can see what's going on there. Yeah, in fact, it's right in front of my nose, as always, but I think this is going to be clearer, Steve, if we go to the previous one, because I don't want to get confounded with the question of stock recruit effect. Yeah, it's the one in, stay where you are, because that's good enough. What we've got in the center of the screen, roughly speaking, there is recruitment. Okay, for those listening in, I'm pointing to a plot, first of all, of the estimates of historical recruitment versus year. And then I've got after that the range of what's simulated into the future.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now when we talk about 10 years or 5 years of poor recruitment, essentially what was done here was to take this envelope here and just multiply everything by a half for the next, whether it's 5 or 10 years, doesn't matter at the moment. That's the nature of what was done. Where the question about 5 or 10 years becomes relevant, I first wanted to make clear what was done, is how realistic is that? This is, even the 5 years is a pretty pessimistic scenario. If you look at what's happened in the past year, you see nothing like that bad. Because yes, you do have periods of poor recruitment here, but if you looked at an average, roughly about 120 over that period. If you looked at half that, an average of 60. An average of 60, you're barely getting anything that's going below 50 anyway, let alone 5 of them in the same
in sequence,
in the same one after the other. Why did we do that? Because be a little bit careful also that when you're just looking at one resource, you've got a limited amount of information. Okay, yes, it's 30 years, but it's still limited. When you look at other resources, both small pelagics, sardine, anchovy, also other resources, you do get instances of runs of poor recruitment. Now, it's one of these sort of norms in the field. Generally, what people are doing is pretty routinely applying this test as 5 years at 50%. Now, in some cases, you've seen something equivalent to that before. In fact, with southern bluefin tuna, we saw exactly that, causing enormous problems around the turn of the century. In other cases, there are few cases, some resources like haddock, who have this peculiar dynamics where you just have one good year class and it sustains the fishery for 20 years, and then you hope you're going to get another one. Halibut, similar. No, sorry, not halibut, redfish. But the reality is here, we haven't seen anything that bad. Now it becomes a debate about, when you put this in for 5 years, and there'll be legitimate differing opinions about this, how plausible is it that is something we need to guard against? And if we do decide we have to guard against, we can't help the resource going down even without a fishery. I'll show you plots about that tomorrow. But in those circumstances, to what extent do we require our rule to rescue us? And I showed you in the other plot we just moved off, we did get a rescue effect from the rule, but nevertheless, the rule came in. It came in at a certain level. It was sufficient to turn things around, but nevertheless, we went fairly low. Was that too low? We'll have a debate tomorrow. But I'm just trying to get the principle of the idea across and to get the point that your question is right on the button. But let's not worry about the details. We'll discuss details tomorrow. For the moment, what is important is to get everyone on top of the concept that you need to do these things, but to check out that these rules can recover you. But there is an open debate possible about how much recovery do you want and how severe have you got to make the rules, and where's the border between reality versus so implausible as to be irrelevant. I mean, the universe could end tomorrow, so why don't we go home and drink? So you get the idea.
So I think that a key point is, because you were kind of asking, have we seen this before, something like this before? And I think basically what, as Decker says, you haven't really. The past data has never been quite as dire as that scenario would suggest. On the other hand, it's not unprecedented in these types of fisheries. So it's not a ridiculous notion. So that's kind of where you're trying to find this sweet spot between what might happen and what has actually happened in the past. So you had a two-part question. Did we get to part two?
I don't know how relevant it is, and it might be talked about tomorrow, but I guess I was just going to say, I mean, since this hasn't happened in the past, obviously we don't know, but this graph, or the graph on the next page, if scenario is a little bit concerning, because it seems like that could have really dire impacts to wildlife and obviously fishermen and others, as well as genetic diversity of the entire population. So again, that might be tomorrow.
The one word answer is tomorrow. What we will show you tomorrow, though, is, and I don't want to get trapped, we want to keep it at a higher level today, is that if you have these circumstances happening, you're going to get bad news for everything else, irrespective of the fishery. Even if you turn the fishery off, there'd still be bad news. Mm-hmm. So you can't avoid bad news. The question is, you can ameliorate it to a certain extent by turning the fishery down. But there you get into the trade-off. The trade-off of the risks to the resource itself, risks to the ecosystem, against risks to the fishery. And it becomes a balancing act. And people around this table will come with legitimately different opinions about what the appropriate trade-off is. Right. But there's no silver bullet that says if that happens, you're going to avoid some nasties. You're going to have to live with them.
All right. Any other questions about this? So we've kind of talked about the sort of premise behind the MSE being this idea of using the past information to sort of create plausible futures, and then also considering variations from that, what Doug refers to as robustness, sort of plausible alternative scenarios, and then asking in the model, how well does a particular management strategy or management procedure work at achieving outcomes that are desirable to you? Recovery of the fishery, potentially minimizing the downside for the fishery, minimizing the downside for the ecosystem, and so on. So that's what the exercise is about. And we had lots of discussion at the February workshop about this work, the work that we've just been talking about, and about where it would go moving forward. So maybe, Robert, you could kind of just pick up the story and talk a little bit about what the group you've been working with has been doing since then. Maybe, Steve, you could put up a PowerPoint slide that was the very last one in my slide deck.
Okay, so I'll just talk somewhat briefly about process. Given the motivations that we had after Dr. Butterworth and Rebecca's illustrative example, which he's just spent some time talking about, we thought a profitable way forward would be to assemble this technical team of scientists that have some experience in not only Menhaden, but other fisheries as well. Most relevantly, I think, a lot of experience with the Gulf and Atlantic Menhaden fisheries. That includes Dr. Jenny Neslage, who's at the University of Maryland, Chesapeake Environmental
Biological Station.
Is it that? Okay. I might have messed up on the acronym there. Amy, of course, who has been the lead assessment scientist at the Beaufort Lab for this and the Atlantic Menhaden stock. Dave Shigaris, who many of you know, working fairly, works closely with NOAA Fisheries and has a very strong research program looking at ecosystem impacts and forage fish dynamics in the Gulf of Mexico and other places. And then I've got some experience as well working in this field. So the idea was to form a technical team that could work collaboratively with Doug's group and come up with a suite of these robustness scenarios that, as Doug mentioned, were derived from alternative looks, alternative assessment outputs from the most recent stock assessment. These were really, the suite of these were really very much based on the either based directly on or were modifications of the sensitivity analysis that we performed. This is a peer-reviewed stock assessment. And the other set, as Doug mentioned, were trying to understand and put together a list of these plausible robustness tests for being able to test, being able to test these control parameters and the resulting harvest control rules under some more extreme cases. So you just saw one, which was a low recruitment scenario, and we've got a couple of others as well. And I won't go into details about those because we're going to see those in detail tomorrow. So our group was really charged with coming up with this suite of robustness tests that would be reasonable to act as a proving ground to test the harvest control rule and the control parameters, which we are going to talk about a lot. We had a lot of conference calls, webinars, and email correspondence with Butterworth and Rebecca Rademeyer, and to develop these. And this occurred almost immediately after the February meeting, continued very heavy into the spring and summer prior to this meeting. And so you're seeing the fruit, at least on the suite of operating models or these robustness tests you'll see is really the result of that work. So I think that's all I'm going to say about this. There might be, just to answer some questions that maybe before they're asked, this group was kept deliberately small because it was a lot of work that needed to be done very quickly. Half a year is a very fast turnaround to accomplish this modeling. I would say probably not unprecedented for Butterworth and Rebecca, but certainly that was very, very quick action. So that's why the group has the composition that it does, and I'd be happy to take any questions. But you'll see the results of this work in the rest of today and tomorrow.
Does anybody have any questions for Robert about that process? I have. Okay, go ahead, Chad. Yeah.
So the paper that Steve distributed, is that the culmination of that work? Is that the work group's report or paper, or is there is there like paperwork or documentation of the group's results, or is that just kind of embedded in that paper per se?
It's embedded in the paper in terms of I believe it's the first table in there is the suite of robustness tests. So that's really the product of that group. The idea, and I think you can appreciate this having been in the assessment arena, is that we wanted to make sure when we got to this meeting and just prior to this meeting, to make sure that we had covered all possible reasonable eventualities of what would be good tests for a control parameter and associated harvest control rule. We didn't want to be caught short, by some reasonable criticism. And so we had thought a lot about what are not duplicative types of robustness tests, what really is the using the word plausible. What are the reasonable, plausible things that we know could happen, and what are the plausible things what is, in terms of our errors of observation, which might come in on the assessment side? Was natural mortality properly parameterized in the assessment model? Was our level of the magnitude of observation error accurately quantified in the assessment model, or our assumed observation error? And if not, how would, through this test of robustness, how would not having that correctly parameterized influence the output of the simulations that you're going to see? Okay.
And so the team met this week prior to today. Is that correct? And so you guys were meeting the last day or two. Is that inclusive of that technical team and everybody else sitting here, or what was that? If that's
so I would say at that point we were about 95% finished with having our suite of robustness tests put together. We added one more following some discussions that we had. Amy had suggested one more. So the majority of the work was finished before we came to this meeting, but on the fly, and rightly so, one more robustness test was added in order to be examined and see some impacts.
And also at this last 2 days, there was a lot of discussion of what the range of management procedures or control rules were that we would want to apply to the model and present and share with this larger group. So it was, I would kind of say it was sort of fine-tuning the work that had mostly been done before that. So
was Dave and Jenny able to join that, or are they not?
No.
Jenny was on the conference call.
So Dave and Jenny were present throughout this whole process, and I don't have a documentation of the number of conference calls, the number of webinars, the number of emails, but it was a lot.
So I have a question for you, which is the table, and maybe I'm kind of thinking maybe we'll want to put that table up before we wrap up this afternoon. But before we do that, the table kind of lists all the things that you did consider. I'm wondering whether it would be fair to ask if you could sort of reflect on things that you talked about but decided not to consider. I mean, the most obvious one was, Shigeris was part of the group partly because you wanted his expertise in sort of ecosystem effects to be applied as best possible to the deliberations that you did. Did you talk about alternative criteria, for example, for what would be a healthy state of the fishery that might be informed by things other than the past is a reasonable indication of what's acceptable? Did you talk about other metrics that you might use to inform the control rule other than the J index that you focused on? I mean, some of those things, and forgive me if we're going to talk about that tomorrow already, but I thought maybe sort of stage setting. Are there some things that were on the table that aren't on the table anymore because of discussions that you had?
So regarding table 1, yes, there were some things that as we individually came up with some robustness tests, there were some that were either somewhat duplicative or totally, wholly duplicative, and then obviously we didn't need to include some of those variants on natural mortality that were best addressed in a different way in a robustness test. So that's to the first point. I think he had 3 things, and that was the second. And the second one, if I'm not answering this, what you've asked, but the second one was to look at other indices that would directly address ecosystem conditions and some reasonable or target biomass of Gulf Menhaden. Is that, I think that's, you had.
Yeah, I guess
like that,
and so. It's sort of a messy, I kind of understand why there's some sort of devils in the details, if you will,
Yes.
but because the threshold, you can change, the value of 0.8 that Doug used for his example. You could make that higher or lower, and that is in effect going to reflect a judgment of where along that scale you're considering things to be okay. So it's sort of buried in that, but I just wondered if there was any more kind of explicit discussion of that.
Yeah, we did discuss that, and we discussed it like we've discussed it here, which is that in the absence of evidence, we fall back on having some minimum biomass is reasonable. And I won't speak to maybe some of Dave's objections to that, reasonable objections, but again, I just say in the absence of evidence, we had some constraints about what our options would be.
And then my third thing was, did you talk about using a metric other than the some combination of the? I know you had two versions of how you combined the two indices, but did you use any Did you think about using any metric other than that, like spawning stock biomass from the assessment?
We had no, and the reason why is because of the very short turnaround that was, necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So all of the reasons why the group in February came to a consensus about why we should use an index-based method, I won't go through all of those, but there are many. And I would say that one thing we probably didn't put as a reason in that report that was, I think, probably rose to the top is that to come up with an MSc that would have addressed that from scratch, in addition to the one that you're seeing now, would have been a very onerous task. And I'm not sure that, so there's some pragmatic reasons why that's the case. And there are many other reasons why we have listed why that's the case. And we don't need a stock assessment to enact a harvest control rule.
You don't need a stock assessment built into the MSc. You mean?
That's exactly, yeah. So there's some practical logistic reasons as
and then we have the correlation that we showed.
We have the correlation that we showed. We've got the history of the very good performance of using these index-based approaches. We've got some literature, thinking the Hilborn work about, this very, these things are not well characterized in, I'm talking target and limit reference points are not very well characterized in a lot of fisheries. This is our first attempt to do it for this one. They've been talking about them in other fisheries that have been exploited for, many, many, many decades, and they're still trying to figure that out. We had, just over 6 months, I guess just under 6 months to try to do this. So there was some pragmatic, and I don't mean to say that as an excuse, but I think that is fairly legitimate for a reason.
Any other? Yes, Doug.
Just to add briefly to that, and Robert, forgive me if I'm repeating anything you said. Certainly, just on the question of the simple rules, what are called empirical, work directly off the indices versus work off the assessment. Many experiences that the simple rules do just about as well as the others, if not better. And secondly, the technical problems, a lot is hidden in 2 words. It's enormous extra computational burden, because you're not just doing a single assessment. In these things, you're doing an assessment every year for the next 20 years, and you're repeating that for 100, minimally 100 different simulations. If you have a simple empirical rule, it takes the computer no time. If you're asking it to do a complex assessment, even computers get tired when they're asked to do it 2,000 times. Yeah. So there are those aspects of it. The other thing we did discuss a little bit was whether we should go beyond the 2 indices that were used in the assessment itself, which are the combined SANE index and the GillNet index. And what was on the table was, well, what about using just the Louisiana index, I think it was, from the SANE index. We didn't go that way, and this is something we can discuss again later this meeting. The reason we didn't go that way is old adage, crawl before you try to walk, let alone sprint. As you'll see from what's been circulated and what we'll discuss tomorrow, these exercises rapidly get very complex given the different combinations of things you're looking at. And the thought was, let's see what we can do with this and see if we can get to some sort of consensus on this before we start elaborating further. Thanks.
This is Robert again. And I will mention in that respect, we had also considered very briefly the inclusion of this Mississippi, Alabama, another GillNet index as well. So, but again, there was some price to pay for that as just a truncation of the time series. So we did look across the landscape of how this could be computationally done, and I think the decisions made coincided well with the decisions made in the stock assessment process, which obviously was under quite a bit of scrutiny.
Great. Very good. Okay. Maybe, Steve, could you open up the document that has the table in it at the very beginning that is the list of variants on the operating model? And we can just put that up. That'll be the sort of last thing we'll do this afternoon before we talk about the refinement. Chad, while he's getting that pulled up.
So we talked at length the last meeting, and it's reflected in the summary report, the reliability and uncertainty of that index and the combined indices from those surveys. And there's some suggested ways to kind of explore the robustness of that and how much legwork were you guys able to do on looking at the reliability of that index? Because I know that was some of the reservation of going to that approach is the actual, because it's not a Menhaden specific survey, and there's a lot of questions about how reliable it is reflecting the abundance in the stock status.
Yeah, this is Robert. I can speak to that just a little bit and just say that if you also recall, we talked a lot about the desirability of whatever control parameter that we had decided on to be consistent with the existing surveys that we had. And it was not reasonable to construct new surveys or dream up new surveys that weren't going to happen, or change state surveys that are designed for other things. So, and so speaking of reliability, I think that the analysis that you are going to see tomorrow and the day after are going to address that very well.
Just to follow up is, there was some discussion and suggestions at looking at other potential, if there's any other data source, like that. What triggered it was when you mentioned the Mississippi, Alabama, and I don't know exactly, I can't remember what that is, but if there's other surveys, whether they're patchy and not continuous over time, but there's other ways to correlate that to show similar trends with that index that's been built for this approach, just to kind of ground truth that, to see if there's other data sources that are saying basically the same thing.
It would, sorry. Oh, I was just going to say, it would seem to me that if that were the case, it would be of considerable interest to the agencies that are doing the stock assessment, right? Because that would be at least as valuable and important for that as it would be for the management strategy evaluation exercise, which is not to say that it isn't important. It's just to say that that makes it even more important that sort of no stone gets left unturned in terms of potential sources of fishery independent data to inform you about the stock.
Yeah, and I'm just reflecting on the summary that was discussed, and that's
Yes.
something that could be further looked into. But I was questioning, was it?
Amy, did you were flirting with the idea of saying something?
Yeah, I was just going to say what you said, basically, is if there was something available that the assessment wasn't aware of, we'd want to know about that. And during the process of a benchmark assessment, I try to take the approach of no stone left unturned turned, and basically all things are on the table for reconsideration. So, you know, the hope is that if there is something out there, that it would come. And I think that over the evolution of this assessment, you can see that having occurred. So when I picked this assessment up, it had very different indices of abundance in it than it has now. And a lot of those changes were related to the fact that some of the state fishery independent data just weren't picked up in the past, or, you know, we censored Texas due to concerns about species ID, or just a variety of different things. And so my view is the indices are the best available science at this point. That doesn't mean that that can't change in the future as we learn new things and move forward. But in this particular moment in time, I don't know of anything that would be better. I mean, the assessment's predicated on that. So
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to say there's something out there that we're not seeing. I'm just wondering if there's other collaborating evidence out there that can say that index is, you know, a good indicator.
Yeah, now that you bring that up, I remember, I sort of remember talking about whether there might even be some remote sensing strategies that could be informative, aerial surveys or something like that. And I mean, you guys use planes to find Menhaden, right? When the fishery does. I remember we kind of talked about that. I don't think we really landed anywhere. That's an unfortunate choice of words, but yeah, I remember us going around the room on that. Robert, did you have something you wanted to add? Yeah. The table is here. Do you want to speak to that, Doug, or something else?
Yes, I think looking towards, Chair, as you said, closing up here, I'd like to just summarize this table, not go into the details, because I think it's actually better that having summarized it, it gives people an introduction to looking at it more closely and debating it tomorrow. And also I'm going to give you an even quicker summary of the initial results that came out of this, because there's an important conclusion there. And again, not to go into details or to discuss it now, but just to give you enough that helps, particularly the newcomers who weren't in earlier discussions this week, pick up on the direction we're going, so you can see whether you agree with it or not. Not in discussion now, but in looking at it overnight and then picking up the discussion tomorrow morning. Now, first with this table, and again, I've got to remember the people who are on the remotely on there. We're looking at a table which is table 1, I think it is, Steve, and it's on page 5 of what's called the July document. It's table 5. So if you can look at that.
Table 5.
Sorry, table 1. It's page
table 1 on page 5.
That's it.
Table 1. Sorry about that, Steve. Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
Oh,
We're where we want to be. I'm just confusing everybody. Okay. What's down the left-hand side of this is what is done in the base case situation, what we call the base case, and that involves not only the assumptions historically that go into the Beaufort assessment model, their base case assessment came out through the peer review, but also what is done going into the future. That's down here. And what you have in the robustness is, well, what was changed? And the changes are one factor at a time. Obviously, you can have more than one factor at a time. But again, crawl before you start walking. Now, in broad terms, first of all, the alternative choices for M, that goes both to what was done in the assessment and what may change in the future. So, for instance, the first 3 are different in terms of the alternates here. They involve refitting the whole assessment model. Amy did that. They were her sensitivity tests, or most of them were. But in this column, the fitting, refit, no refitting, refitting, when it is a change that affects the past, the whole assessment has to be redone, because you self-consistently go through with that alternative one. On the other hand, these other 2 affect only the future, and this is to do with some of the ecosystem considerations that have been raised. But for those, you don't have to refit the model. It's just a different assumption you use going into the future. So just so you've got some idea here. And what is type about? You can think about that. But we had a sort of double category here. There was type A, where we think, yes, there is an argument to say this might be plausible. The type B ones are really pushing the envelope to the extent that the reason they were done was not so much to argue that they are plausible, but more to see, could you break the procedure? So there was an implicit plausibility argument in the A's and the B's here, but that doesn't mean necessarily that all the B's are not plausible and all the A's are plausible. We could still have some debate about that, but it's a first cut at that. Now, just briefly with the others as well, catch selectivity. Menhaden has a very peak selectivity function. Nearly all the fish that are caught are coming from age 2. And the basis for that is the best assumption given the model and given some information, because natural mortality also affects that. But the basis here is what was done for the base case assessment by Amy and colleagues. But we've looked at variations of that going back historically, and also a change going into the future, so forth. Then the indices, and this picks up to an extent on some of Chad's concerns. We have certain assumptions projecting into the future, because that's really where the indices come into the things, projecting into the future. We have to make some assumptions that are drawn from what happened in the past, but we can change those assumptions as well to see what's going on. And some of them here, Chad, to your point about are the indices as reliable as we're making out? This is addressing that in part, because in the past, we're saying with the indices here, they're surprisingly good. Actually, a coefficient of variation, which has been called observation error here, of only 11%, which is saying typically variation above the true abundance is only up or down within 20%. But we've pushed in some of the simulations, we've pushed that much higher. And to an extent, that's addressing your question of, are we assuming, could things be worse in the future than they seem to have been in the past? Now, there are a number of others there too. We needn't go into the details here. You can look at them overnight. There's the question of the period of future poor recruitment, which we discussed a moment ago. It was taken to be 5 years here. There's a stock recruitment function, which is always a problem. And again, I'll go into the details of that tomorrow. The question of underreporting, whether it's catches or landings, the point here is one makes the assumption when the control rule comes into play that we've actually assumed exactly that catch is taken and no more or less than that catch is taken. But it's not impossible when things start to bite that the economic pressures are such that somehow or other, not everything that's taken is reported. So this is picking up on that point as well, this underreporting, that you could have 10% underreporting of future TACs. And this is a technical one. I'd rather not get into that today because it is important. It will come up in our discussions tomorrow. So just to say, we did put a limitation on the maximum fishing mortality, but you have to be a little bit careful about that, and better that I don't get into that now. We can pick it up tomorrow. So just one more thing to say about after this, but before I do, can we just open up to any very, don't get into details here, just at very broad level. Was this clear or were there any very broad questions you need to know about at this stage?
Yeah, it's all right. Sorry. That's fine. So did Doug's just, does anybody have any questions about this? I'm going to make one comment and then and that is with regards to the one that's listed as 2.3. I just draw your attention to that because that was something that we talked about quite a bit at one point during the February workshop, and this is the idea that there might be a change in the way the fishery is operated, particularly if it becomes more difficult to catch 2-year-old Menhaden, where selectivity on 1-year-old Menhaden would go up. And so that was a scenario that I recall us discussing. That if I'm not mistaken, that sensitivity test is to sort of say, right now, as Doug said, the fishery really targets 2-year-olds, and it could be that if they're meeting your harvest goals wasn't happening with 2-year-olds, that the operation of the fishery might change in a way that would change that selectivity pattern in a way we haven't observed in the past. So that was an attempt to capture that. Are there any other questions or thoughts on this? So this is kind of what the analytical team has done in terms of sort of kicking the model around to make sure that when they do the MSc, they evaluate these management procedures, that what you see is reasonably robust to a wide variety of plausible assumptions about both the future and the structure of the model. Okay, so we'll be diving right into this head first, so bring your mask and snorkel tomorrow. And for the remainder of this afternoon, I haven't forgotten, Dave, that you want to make a comment, but for the remainder of this afternoon, the modeling team has to kind of reconvene to fine-tune some of the presentation material that we're going to be sharing with the larger group tomorrow. The rest of you, after Dave has some closing remarks, are free to either listen in or carry on to whatever else you're doing with your lives right now. So, Doug.
One last point. I promise this is the last one today. Steve, can you just move on to figure 3? And this is going to be even more brief and superficial. So it's down on page 9, Steve. Okay. Now, what you're seeing along the horizontal axis here is those various robustness tests. And in the top plot is what's the lowest that the egg production goes to. In the bottom plot, the lowest the landings go to. And red is something different here. Red are the B ones, less plausible. Black are the more plausible robustness tests. But what stands out here is most of the time, as you go from the original base case, which is on the left most of this plot, and you look at most of the others, you see virtually no difference. And you also see virtually no difference whether or not you have the rule. But there are 3 cases that stand out dramatically from the others. And I want people to look at that very closely overnight to make sure you're seeing what those are and are getting at least an initial understanding of this. We'll get into more details tomorrow, because what you'll find as we go tomorrow, the fact that those 3 are so different, and different in an important way, is why most of our subsequent concentration has been only on those cases.
As well as the base case.
Yes, as well, of course, as the base case, because the other ones really, and particularly compared to these ones, don't make much of a difference. It's a very interesting point, but again, even this one, I don't want to take questions of clarification here. This is a homework instruction. Just have a look at that plot before we come into it tomorrow.
And we'll collect your papers at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Yeah, because this is a very important part of the basis we use to move forward. So thanks, Chair.
Okay. Before we wrap up, Dave, you had a couple of comments you wanted to make?
Yeah, just real quickly. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be here tomorrow or Friday. I've got to get back to the office for some other obligations. But I just wanted to thank everybody for their time and participation, being here, and it's important that we get everybody that's involved sitting around the table. The Commission's got a long history of working with the Menhaden industry in the Gulf of Mexico. We provide a forum to get everybody that's interested in a variety of issues, including Menhaden, and we get them together. And we've done that in the past and continue to do that. And these workshops is a perfect example of providing that forum and the commitment that the commission has to do that, to facilitate these discussions and hopefully develop solutions for the issues and opportunities that have been identified. So I just want to thank everybody. Good luck tomorrow and Friday, and appreciate y'all's efforts.
Very good. Thanks, Dave. So we're adjourned for the day for today, Dan. Thank you for your attention. We'll see you here tomorrow morning at 8:30. Again, remind you, if you come hungry, you won't be disappointed.
Just a few of the
I don't know that we'll go all the way to 5, but that's what's on the schedule. Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out. I need to
have a look at some further things.
do something at Will at some point tomorrow afternoon. So do you think after lunch would be the best time or later in the